I spent most of my adult life working on oil rigs, primarily as a saturation diver. I always enjoyed the solitude of the job. At times, I had to work at depths of almost 1,000 feet underwater. I've spent almost all of my conscious adult life completely isolated from the outside world. No matter what happens at such depths, you can't just surface, run away, even from death. You are forced to look it in the eye and slowly, incredibly slowly, undergo decompression. If you've been at a depth of 250 feet for just an hour, your ascent of decompression time will be 5 hours to prevent even the slightest sign of decompression sickness, what we call the bends. This happens when the gases from the compressed air you breathe begin to expand, and depending on the depth, it can kill you after inflicting debilitating and terrible pain. No experienced saturation diver would ever take that risk, and we always surface and decompress very slowly. That's why I'm here to tell my story. If I had succumbed to my instinct, I would have died. I dedicated 8 years to my job before I changed my mind about my love for it. If I had heard a similar story from one of my colleagues, I would have just laughed and happily gone on. However, this wasn't a second-hand story, not something told over dinner and contraband beer. This happened to me, and I'm going to tell you about it, even if there are those among you who will mock, snicker, and think I'm making it all up for attention. So listen, do you know who I'm laughing at now? The people who say there are no mysteries left on our Earth, no unexplored places left, that there's nothing that hasn't been explained by science. Those are the people I'm laughing at now. I used to laugh at many people's stories. Not anymore. There are things left on this Earth you wouldn't want to meet, and I had the dubious pleasure of encountering more than one of them while working on the Jupiter oil rig. It was a gigantic undertaking when my bosses decided to move the entire Jupiter operation, rig and all, to a different part of the ocean. This meant that the rotation crews would have to work overtime, stay on the rig indefinitely, and sacrifice sleep. We were all being paid well, so nobody complained at first. Well, not too much anyway. But that always changes on an oil rig. You can't keep a bunch of rough men in the middle of the ocean indefinitely and expect things to run smoothly for very long. Eventually, tension and fights become commonplace. Still, I couldn't imagine a better job, at least not then. By the time the platform was installed in its new location, there had been a couple of nasty fights among the crew members. They were immediately sent home and replaced with other land-based workers. Harvey, my new supervisor, the boss of Jupiter, held up like a hero. He practically lived on Jupiter and loved his rowdy crew, even though they sometimes caused him trouble with his higher-ups. It was time for me to start my work. I had been working on the deck while the platform was moved, and now it was time to descend back into what John and I called the metal pipe to prepare to begin the underwater work. This time we were supposed to be there for months, trying to get the entire system up and running safely and securely. There were only 2 of us living in the pressurized system beneath the floating barge, ready to go out and work under the rig at a moment's notice, hooking up pipelines, ensuring sound construction, flipping valves to money-making mode. Jed Clampett was right when he called oil black gold. Living in the pressurized system beneath the barge at a shallower depth than the one we worked at saturated our bodies with gases, which allowed us to stay underwater indefinitely. Thus, we became a valuable asset to the company that owned Jupiter, and we knew it. John didn't enjoy the isolation in the work as much as I did. He liked the pay. If a janitor job on the beach offered him the same salary, John would have taken it without a second thought. I, on the contrary, would go crazy within a week if I had to deal with people, noise, and the chaos of the land world. There were several people working on the barge above us. They were, in essence, responsible for our lives. They supplied us with food, compressed air, and made our stay as comfortable as possible. They messed up, and we died. There was a medical team, of course, but no one wanted to call them. It would mean the situation was likely irreversible. That part of my job used to bother me, but I got used to it pretty quickly.
The first couple of weeks after John and I started our 7-hour shifts on the seabed were perfectly normal. In fact, boringly perfect. Usually, there are exciting encounters with deep-sea life, but the seafloor seemed a little empty. If I hadn't been so engrossed in John's sad tales about his recent girlfriend, I might have pondered how strange this lack of creatures was, but my head was still trying to process the fact that John had told her she could get another boyfriend while he was at work. No, I couldn't do that. Maybe that's why I never tried to have a relationship after becoming a saturation diver. In the third week, John and I connected some preliminary pipelines for a test and finished our shift. Back in the metal pipe, we waited for dinner. John looked at me, trying to reach his girlfriend on his mobile, and his expression changed. He put his phone on the table, smiled, folded his arms, and leaned forward. "Did you hear that?" John's smile wasn't a happy one, I noticed. It was strained, and he looked nervous. He sounded like Donald Duck. We both sounded like that, of course, but for some reason, this time I found it funny, and I grinned. "I'm afraid not, buddy." Okay. Our dinner came down through the pressurized delivery system, and we ate in silence. I noticed that John was pale and agitated, his eyes darting back and forth, fixing on nothing. Before I decided to play solitaire, I asked John if he was okay, and he replied by asking if I had seen anything strange down there when we were working earlier. "No," I replied. "It's the bottom of the ocean, you know. Everything looks strange at this depth. There were creatures that glowed, fish by dangling a built-in light in front of their mouths. Yes, there were strange things, but nothing that went beyond the realm of strange." The next day, John was worse, and after our shift, his vital signs were no longer within the normal range. Fearing he was sick, the medical team deemed it necessary to prepare him for removal from the job. He would have to decompress in an isolation chamber just to make sure he didn't pass any germs to me. A simple cold can be fatal in my line of work. Blocked sinuses can cause a pressure trap that we can't equalize, and that can lead to irreversible damage, or even death in some cases. I would probably have to finish the job alone. I would be there for at least a month by myself until someone else could be found who could safely go through the saturation process to live in the pipe for the remainder of the job. The next day was, well, it was laborious. I tried to adjust my work to include some of John's duties. I double-checked the pipeline we had connected the day before, just to make sure nothing was missed. John was obviously sick or something because the fastening bands were missing. I would have to dismantle everything and reassemble it properly. The medical team didn't allow me to question John that evening, saying he was too unstable for any worries, and they didn't give me any details about his diagnosis. This worried me for my own well-being. Was he contagious? Did he pass some germ to me? I didn't feel sick, but the medical team definitely started monitoring me more closely after John went into the isolation chamber for decompression. The next day I went out to start my duties, and the first thing I noticed as I descended to the seabed was a complete lack of movement except for mine. The lights at the worksite glowed faintly through the blackness as I approached, and it looked like an alien settlement to me. Rarely did I feel strange entering a workspace that I myself had set up, but on this day I did. The water seemed darker, not murkier, just blacker. I remotely requested a check of all the lighting as I descended, and one of the barge crew members replied that all the lights were working fine according to their monitors up top. He asked if everything was okay, and I replied in the affirmative, even though I felt that it wasn't. I worked for hours without stopping for a break and felt somewhat tired when I finally took one. It's easy to get lost in the work and forget to rest when you're all alone down there, but I wasn't alone. Several times I noticed movement on the bottom, literally out of my corner of eye, but when I turned to look, everything was still. However, something was just outside the circle of light, and I was sure of it. As the day came to an end, I began to ascend to my pipe and rest. I would soon need to start dismantling the pipeline that John had messed up, and I wasn't looking forward to it. As soon as I exited the light zone of the worksite, something moved right behind me. The wave from its movement pushed me aside. I frantically swept my light around trying to find the cause, but saw nothing. A shark, that was my first thought, and actually my first worry. They usually didn't bother us, but this was unheard of in our work. I hurried up the line, my light swinging wildly and arcing through the water. I had ascended about 40 feet when the creature swam past me again. This time it grazed me, and when I turned with my light, I saw something that looked like a ray swimming away into the blackness. Did this thing have arms? I saw arms and long hair streaming and flowing in the water from its head. My heart was pounding and throbbing in my ears, and my vision swam. Focusing on my breathing, I pulled myself up the line, forcing my movements to be smooth and controlled. I couldn't have seen that. It was just a strange deep-sea creature that resembled a humanoid. Besides, I felt scales scraping against my rubber suit. If it had scales, it was in no way human. Another 20 feet, and I convinced myself that I hadn't seen anything too unusual. 10 feet later, well, I came face to face with the creature.
It was blocking my ascent, right in front of me. I let go of the line and pushed back. It was dangerous, but no more dangerous than contact with this thing. It was enormous, easily twice my size, maybe even more, considering its midsection was shaped like a ray, flat and rounded, constantly moving. It was gripping my line with a hand that had webbed fingers and black claws. Its eyes were huge and almond-shaped, taking up almost the entire top half of its face. Right below the eyes was a circular mouth full of tiny, sharp, yellow teeth. I pushed back as it approached, and soon the main line was far out of reach, and I was struggling to get away. I bumped into something, and my heart almost burst from fear. Tentacles wrapped around me, and I struggled to keep them away. This thing was pulling me farther down, away from the monster on my line and farther from safety. My radio wasn't working, so there was no help from the surface either. I was completely alone. The tentacles didn't have suckers. The more I struggled, the more painful the thing's grip became. I didn't need light to feel the tiny, piercing spines on the tentacles. And then another creature spiraled up to us and reached out with its claws to tap the glass of my mask. I was too terrified to scream. I could only stare with wide eyes, that scream stuck in my throat. I was going to die there, in the grip of sea monsters, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I stopped struggling to prevent the spines from puncturing my suit. The creature dragged me to the bottom, to the work site. It wrapped one tentacle around me, pinning my arms to my sides, and pushed me away from its wiry body so I could look at it. It was some kind of squid hybrid that had no human features at all, but there was intelligence in its eyes. Its body swayed, and I watched with revulsion. God, please don't let me end up like this, I thought, still paralyzed by fear and indefinite pain from the spines. The other creature swam away, circling me, and I heard its high-pitched, piercing call echoing through the water. It hurt my eyes, and they teared up a bit. More ray-like creatures appeared in view. It was a crowd, and the crowd parted. They simultaneously turned their heads toward the darkness. Something was approaching. Something big. The creatures began to tremble toward whatever was approaching, as if they were reverent worshippers calling upon their deity. The grip of the thing holding me began to loosen, and my brain started working. If the tentacle loosened enough, I might escape. I couldn't take my eyes off the darkness, and I could perceive movement there behind the curtain of blackness. The creature holding me was shaking and shuddering, as if in fear. Of course, I was attributing human emotions to the actions of this monster, but that's what it looked like. A larger creature was slowly, even confidently emerging from the black waters. First came the head, the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and festooned on the sides with long, thin, whisker-like appendages that fluttered in the water. The mouth was like a lion's, but much, much bigger. The body of this thing was longer than a school bus and worm-like. It had a double set of tentacles just below its face. It moved through the water like a snake on land. And as it passed through the parted crowd, one of the tentacles shot out, grabbed a panicked creature, and pulled it closer. The mouth didn't open, but a section of its belly below the set of tentacles unfolded. From this opening, several long, worm-like bodies emerged, and at the end of each worm was a circular mouth, similar to the mouth of the first monster I encountered. These mouths quickly made short work of the struggling creature. The tentacle holding me dropped away, and I began to float upward, unnoticed, as this horror approached the squid hybrid, which seemed to shrink from its approach. Soon the ascent line was within reach, and I knew I would be outside the circle of light. I didn't dare thrash or struggle to speed up my rescue. They would notice the movement of the water if I did. Not soon enough, but still I grabbed the line and ascended quickly. The medical staff decided I had gone off the deep end when I started telling them what had happened. I had moments of pure panic and terror when I got back to the pipe. During those moments, I was sure these creatures, these monsters had followed me and would break through all the reinforced steel to get me, to offer me to their leader or whatever that thing was. I heard a couple of them joke about how madness was contagious and that John and I both had caught it, apparently. Yeah, well, very funny for them. They hadn't seen those things. As soon as we could get topside, I asked John if he had seen them. About a month after we were brought up, John and I were sitting and having a drink at a local bar. We had avoided talking about what happened down there. We had avoided each other for the most part. Finally, I asked him what had happened, and he said he thought he was losing his mind. The isolation of the job had finally gotten to him, and he wanted to quit. He had seen things down there that couldn't exist. Well, at least I got my answers. I wasn't crazy. Neither was John. So the company sent a 6-person team down there to finish the job. 2 weeks later, all of them vanished, except one. He surfaced from the seabed right to the surface and died afterward. The medical team recorded his ravings about monsters and added them to their files alongside mine and John's ravings. The government ordered these files destroyed, and John and I were visited by officials who unambiguously told us to keep silent about anything we might have seen or experienced down there. They didn't want people trying to dive there and find what we had seen. They would label us crazy, attribute it to a breach of work protocol, and lock us up in a maximum security mental institution for the rest of our lives. So, that's my story. I have taken steps to ensure no one learns my identity through this account. I just wanted people to know what lurks in the deep before something happens to me. I don't really trust those government lackeys who are watching us so closely these days, and you all deserve to know the truth.